morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Irvin Dyer, and I want to welcome you this morning to the Africana Family Storytelling webinar. So we're excited to have you with us this morning. We have a great panel. I think we have an exciting presentation, and we want to leave you with information that will both motivate and instruct you on why and how to tell your family stories. Before we get started, I want to remind you that you can take notes. You might want to get paper and pencil or take notes on your computer. Okay? First of all, there are basically 3 reasons why we want to present this webinar. Number 1, so I will tell a little story about visiting my grandmother's house. My grandmother lived in rural Hanover County, Virginia. And when I was a young man, 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, I would often sit in her kitchen in front of her stove and share stories of my 1st grade, 2nd grade life. My grandmother was a great listener. She had great patience. But one of the things I failed to do while telling my grandmother all of my stories is I failed to be conscientious enough to get her to tell me her own stories. So I never knew how she met her husband. I never knew to talk to her about her parents. So all those stories escaped me. By the time I got old enough to want to share those stories, my grandmother had passed away. So we want to encourage you this morning to not let that happen, to have the conversations with your family members while they're here and begin to tell those stories. Number 2, I was a child of the 60s and 70s. So I grew up watching a lot of family-oriented television shows. There was The Waltons, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, The Cosby Show, What's Happening, and of course, one of my favorites was Roots. But what these television shows meant to me in my young mind then was that the stories of other people's families were more important than the stories of my own families. So we want to remind you today that that is not true. Your stories matter, and the stories of your family member matters. And so we want you to think about ways that you can share those stories, document those stories, and have those stories for yourself to pass on. And number 3, and perhaps most importantly, we think that sharing your family stories can address this whole issue of what I call narrative bias. This is the sense that when someone other than yourself is writing your family story, they have control of the story. If they have biases, certain prejudices, and certain misunderstandings about who you are as an individual, about who you and your family are as collective, then those biases, those prejudices can make their way into the storytelling. But when you take control and you tell your own family stories, you can decide how to share the full humanity of who people are, the full character of who they are, and other issues that are present and happening and valuable to their life. When other people sometimes tell stories, they can be devalued, they can dehumanize people, but when you have control, that doesn't have to happen. So, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. First of all, we'd like to thank the University of Pittsburgh and the Year of Creativity, a project that empowers creativity and innovation and ideas. So thank you, University of Pittsburgh. We'd also like to thank the Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, which for more than 30 years has been celebrating stories of Africana people. And finally, we'd like to thank the August Wilson House. I'm a board member of the August Wilson House, and the August Wilson House is dedicated to celebrating the legacy of one of America's greatest playwrights, right? About a year ago, August Wilson House launched its own initiative, a special project, Your Story Matters, to encourage local residents and residents in the Hill District to share their family stories, to document those stories, and perhaps have them live in an archive at the August Wilson House. So we certainly want to thank the August Wilson House for helping us with this project. And now I'm going to introduce our panelists, a group of incredible storytellers. First, you're going to hear from Harold Hayes. For many years, Harold Hayes worked for the broadcast station KDKA-TV. He's also an Emmy-winning broadcast journalist. He's going to share his family story and talk to us a little bit about why and how he decided to do that. Next, we're going to hear from Ms. Monica Haynes. Monica Haynes is an award-winning journalist who used to work with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. She's also a genealogist. For many years, she's researched her own family's history. And a year ago, she helped me with a special project to do some documentation of my own mother's history. So welcome, Monica. And she's going to talk to us about how to use genealogical tools and provide some tips that help us to navigate those sources. And then we're going to hear from Lucretia Wembley. Lucretia is a news reporter with the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and she's going to help us begin to think about how we can organize all this data and information that we've collected. So you've done some genealogical research, you've had some interviews, you've collected all of this information. Lucretia is going to talk to us about how we can make our way through it and pull it all together. And then last but not least, we're going to hear from Miss Allegra Badham. Allegra is an award-winning audio journalist who's done some reports from Haiti and also from Germany. And she's going to talk to us about audio-visual journalism, but also present to us ideas about how storytelling can be unique and think outside of the box about how to tell some of these stories, okay? And I'd also like to give a shout out to Nan and Andy, who are helping us behind the scenes with some of our tech issues. And we think we have all of those worked out, but we'll get through them as we move throughout this program. A little bit about our format. So all the panelists will present, and they're going to present for about 15 to 20 minutes. We're going to run through all of them, and then we're going to open up for your questions and answer as many of your questions as possible, okay? So let's get started. And with that, we're going to turn it over to Harold Hayes. Good morning, Harold.
Good morning, Irvin. Good morning to all the panelists and all of those who are joining us in this webinar. I started this journey of trying to find out about my family when I happened to be in the National Archives, their original building in downtown Washington. I originally went in there just to see what I could find about a number of things, the Kennedy assassination. There were all kinds of documents, obviously, in that building. That seemed daunting to me. And then I saw over in a room that this was the genealogy section. And I wandered over there not knowing what to find or where to find it. They at the time had a lot of microfilms of census information. And I happened to find the 1920 census information for Lynchburg, Virginia, where my father's family was from. And then I found the listing of Thomas Hayes, his father, my grandfather, who I never met, who died the year I was born, and then saw the list of my father, Harold, and his brothers and sisters, who were my aunts and uncles. And from finding that, that started this process sometime in the 1980s, and it really hasn't stopped. I also, as time went on, some of my cousins shared with me an oral history that my aunt wrote down with regard to her perceptions of her grandparents, maternal and paternal. The records involving African Americans I found is not as meticulous as the records of some others. Sometimes it's very difficult to sort through it, but the journey isn't finished. So here on video are some of the highlights I found along the way. And I'll ask Dr. Dyer to start our video if he can. Irv, I'm not sure if you can hear me now, but we're having trouble hearing that audio. The video is there, but people aren't hearing the audio. Um, Maybe we need to rack that up again.
Weldon Johnson,
Okay.
established to provide opportunities for
We're going to have to
African-American
rack it
children
because
through
nobody
funds.
heard anything from the beginning.
So no one heard any of it?
No, not at all. So just re-rack it to the top and.
Okay.
Yes, sounds good now, Irv.
Oh, thank you.
Sorry about
Comes
that.
from all kinds of sources: census records, marriage and death records, oral histories, and even newspaper articles. For example, in February of 1953, 2 months before I was born, this article appeared in the Pittsburgh Courier. Ministers reject Jim Crow picnic proposal. Not from Montgomery, Alabama or Jackson, Mississippi. The story was from West Mifflin, Pennsylvania. My father, Harold Hayes Sr., as pastor of Bethlehem Baptist Church in McKeesport, was among the ministers who rejected the so-called Jim Crow picnic proposal at Kennywood Park. At that time, black churches could have their picnics at Kennywood, but were not allowed to use the pool. The issue was eventually settled when Kennywood closed the pool. My father was born in 1909, one of 9 children born to Thomas and Cora Hayes in Lynchburg, Virginia. His father worked as a janitor and later as a freight handler for the Southern Railroad in Lynchburg. My father and several of his brothers came to New Homestead in search of the industrial jobs in the Mon Valley. His sister, my Aunt Hilda, produced a written account of the Hayes family genealogy. She wrote that her paternal grandfather was a free black who was a metalsmith from Richmond. Just before the Civil War, he moved to Lynchburg, where he met and after purchasing her freedom, married an indentured servant. She says he made ammunition during the war in Williamsburg. Regarding her other grandparents, she wrote, my maternal grandparents were Captain Albert McDaniel and Mrs. Rachel Brown. Captain McDaniel was the owner of a large plantation in Bedford County, Virginia. My grandmother and her husband were tenants on the McDaniel plantation. She explained that after Rachel's husband died, she eventually became a cook in the McDaniel household. Aunt Hilda's and my father's mother was Cora Brown Hayes, who married Thomas Hayes in 1895. But on their marriage record, Cora Brown's parents were listed as John and Rachel Brown. So my family history says my paternal grandmother was fathered by a wealthy white landowner. The official record says her father was a black tenant on the plantation. My mother was Gladys Burrell Hayes, seen here as a student at Belsuver Elementary School. Her resume reveals she went to Howard University in Washington and graduated in 1937 with a BA in education. In 1939, she taught English and acted as librarian at the segregated Fountain Inn High School in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. Fountain Inn's Negro School Complex was a grade school, a library, a high school, and a gym. This house served as housing for all the teachers as well as the principal and his family. After that, her summers through 1943 were spent as a counselor at Camp James Weldon Johnson, established to provide opportunities for African American children through funds first raised by Pittsburgh Courier editor Robert L. Vann. For the next 8 years, she was a probation officer for the Juvenile Court of Allegheny County. Juvenile Court back then was at 3333 Forbes Avenue in Oakland. She left juvenile court in 1951 when she married my father, who was about to begin his ministry at Bethlehem. Her social work background served her well as a parent, a minister's wife, and after my father's death as a teacher again in the Pittsburgh public school system. Her mother was Isma Heatherbell Green Burrell, seen here in the front row wearing glasses. She and the others in this picture were ushers at Bethel AME Church. This picture was taken in 1927 in front of the Old Bethel, the first black church established in the city of Pittsburgh in the early 1800s. That building was torn down in 1957 to make way for the Civic Arena. And I remember as a kid, my grandmother wasn't happy that Bethel had to move. Neither were many of the people who lived in the Lower Hill District. On the left is a 1950 Courier article she kept in a scrapbook. Reverend Andrew Huey was pastor at the time and eventually dealt with the early negotiations as the city moved to relocate homes, businesses, and churches. My grandmother was one of 14 children who grew up in the Oil City area of Venango County, Pennsylvania. Her father, John Charles Green, born in 1855, was a stonecutter by trade, but eventually worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad in Oil City. Her mother, Iola, was born in 1865, the year Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. She and John were born in the Richmond, Virginia area. John and Iola's son, David, one of my grandmother's younger brothers, eventually became a Pullman porter. I've always wondered whether he was inspired by a porter who married David's sister when David was 15 years old. That Pullman porter was my grandfather, Thomas Lewis Burrell. He was a porter for 42 years on the Pennsylvania Railroad. Census records from Rappahannock County, Virginia shows he was one of 10 children born to William and Louise Burrell, who were married in 1882. This is Thomas seen here seated in the front with 3 of his brothers, likely in the 1920s. He left rural Virginia and was hired by the Pullman Company in 1909. Porters were required to work 400 hours per month or 11,000 miles, whichever came first, to receive full pay. That averaged out to 12 hours a day. A. Philip Randolph took up their cause when he formed the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Not long after that, the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Pullman Porters was formed to help support the work of the union. This is a Courier picture of a Pittsburgh meeting of the auxiliary in 1950. My grandmother is in the top row. This was my grandfather's tax return just before he retired. The dollar went a lot further in 1950 than it does today, but he reported earnings of $3,200 plus $700 in tips, but he subtracted $600 in traveling expenses. Porters had to buy their own brushes and shoe polishing equipment. They got their meals on the train, but had to pay half price.
So even under those economic conditions, Thomas Burrell built a house in Belsuver. He bought the land in 1922 and built the house in 1925 and paid off the mortgage in 1951, just before he retired. One of the questions for this webinar when they asked the panelists to join was, why is history important and how does it affect you as you, through your own life? And I could say that as covering news at KDKA for about 37 years, anytime I would cover a civil rights issue, I couldn't help but think of my father, who was dealing with civil rights issues as a pastor in McKeesport in the 1950s. Anytime I covered the courts and crime, and I covered plenty of that, I couldn't help but think about my mother as a social worker and whether early intervention in a number of people's lives may have changed those lives. Anytime I covered the demolition, by the time I came along, of the Civic Arena, I couldn't help but think about Isma Burrell and the ushers and everybody else at Bethel AME Church. I couldn't help but think about the people who lived in the Lower Hill District. I saw in one of our chats that Salahuddin is watching this. He has quite a history as one who was displaced during that transformation of the lower hill, and it's still an issue today. And every time we did a live report in front of the federal courthouse, to get the shot of the federal courthouse, we stood on the sidewalk of the Pennsylvania Railroad station. And I couldn't help think about my grandfather walking up that sidewalk on his way to work. So it affects you for generations to come. We are a product of our ancestors, and we shouldn't forget them. Irv?
So thank you very much, Harold. Thank you. And I think what Harold's story sort of underscores for me is the fullness of telling his stories, right? You see his family being involved with faith and education, labor issues and social issues. And so in telling his story, he tells a fuller story of the humans that are behind all of these issues. We're going to now move to Monica Haynes. And Monica is going to help provide us with more tips and suggestions about how to get our way through some genealogical research. Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Dr. Dyer, and welcome everyone. I'm going to attempt to get into my presentation. Hopefully we won't have any of those dreaded technical difficulties. Okay, I guess I'm having some technical difficulties because I was playing this earlier and now it's giving me some kind of error message telling me that I'm unable to play it. So let's see if we can just at least get through past this first slide. Unfortunately, it was a video, just an opening. So we'll try to get to the next one. Okay, and so I'm here to talk about genealogy. And the first video, unfortunately, it wouldn't play for some reason. The first video was a slide presentation of some of the relatives that I found through my genealogy research. It was just sort of a photo slideshow of relatives that I found through my research. And as the background music, I had used the music from Roots, the miniseries from 1977 that started a lot of African-American people on their own journey to find the people in their family, to find their family history. So I will give you just kind of a technical definition of genealogy, and it's the, move this out the way here a little bit. It's an account of the descent of a person, a family, or group from one ancestor, and basically it's just the study of your family history and where you come from. And most genealogists, or at least the people that I know, and amateur genealogists like myself, you try to go back as far as you can. You know, you try to have that Alex Haley moment if you can. It's very difficult for African Americans, but you know, that is my goal, is to try to go back and see if I can get back to Africa. And so when we're talking about genealogy, and we hear all these great stories, but also one of the questions that I have for the audience, the participants who haven't started this, or maybe some of the people that have, is, are you ready? And the reason that I say, I ask this question is because sometimes when you start to dig deep, into your family history, into your roots, and into those stories, sometimes things can fall out that will be disturbing, or some things that you don't expect. And so you have to be prepared for that as well. The photo that you see on the screen is from a story that I did in 2005 when I was with the Post-Gazette. And I had done a lot of research into my biological mother and my biological father. I wasn't raised by my biological parents. And so it took a lot of research and a lot of digging to find their family history. I didn't have grandparents or anybody to sit down and talk to and get the history from. So it was really a lot of research and a lot of digging to find the stuff that I found, but I was very determined. And fortunately for me, I knew the names of both my parents. I knew that my father was from Richmond, Virginia, and his name was Russell Toombs, and I knew my mother's name, and I knew that her family roots were in Maryland, in a place called Denton, Maryland. And so, like a lot of people that were into family history and digging, as soon as the DNA became available, the DNA test, I did take the DNA test with Ancestry. I didn't really pay that much attention to the results of the DNA, aside from, you know, my ethnicity, of course. And I can tell you that I'm 41% Nigerian and even a little bit Norwegian. Don't ask me where that came from, but it's in the DNA. And so when I did my a master's project, I focused on my father's family from Virginia, and I did this interactive project. And so what you see on the screen is some of the photos of people from my father's family, grandparents, great uncles, cousins, and things like that. I went to a webinar on genealogy and went back home excited and dove into my DNA results. And the more that I looked at my results on my father's side, I discovered that I did not match up with any of my father's family. Now, he had passed away, my mother had passed away, and I had to realize upon looking at these results further that my biological father was not my biological father. And so the thought in my mind was, I just play this little clip. So that was my thinking. I had to regroup and figure out how I was going to find my father when nobody knew who my father was. But I did do the research. I did interview people, call people, look at the DNA results more closely, and started to contact those people that I matched up with. And I narrowed it down and found out that this is my father. His name is Pliny Watts Robinson, and I'm trying to move this display here. Pliny Watts Robinson, and the Robinson family hails from this place called Quitman, Georgia. It's a little tiny town south of Georgia. As you can see on the screen, 3,800 people. And the names that you see around here are all people from my family. The Spencers, the Watts, this is my grandmother's maiden name, Bryants, Thomases, and Stokes. And so now I'm going to show you a little video snippet of someone who's from my extended Stokes family.
followed Slater Samuel Stokes' family tree back to his own grandparents, Henry and Emily Stokes, both born into slavery in the 1820s in Georgia. To learn more about their lives, we needed to find the name of their owner. So, using their last name Stokes, we began our search. Only one white Stokes was living in the area during that time.
Well, that narrows it down.
That narrows it down,
Yeah.
there's no doubt.
Yeah.
And that's this man here.
Name of slave owner, J.W. Stokes.
That's right. J.W. Stokes owned almost 36 slaves.
It's a pretty big, rich number, isn't it?
Yep.
Number of slave houses, 6. What does that mean? Cabins? Or
Yeah,
something?
cabins.
For 35 people?
That's 6 per.
Oh, it's terrible. I mean, I've been able to visit slave cabins and to be able to go into those very tight quarters. That's why I said 35 and 6.
Oh, yeah. No running water.
Yeah.
We found out that Henry and Emily lived on the Stokes plantation in Georgia for most of their lives, including through the Civil War.
Okay, as you can see from that, that was Angela Bassett, and she is a descendant of the Stokeses from Quitman, Georgia area. Now I have to tell you, I don't know Angela Bassett personally. I can't get you into the movies or anything like that. But I can show you how, what the connection is between Angela Bassett and myself. Okay, this is Alpha Watt Stokes, and she is the sister to my grandmother. So she is my great aunt. And as you can see, she was born in Quitman, Georgia, Brooks County, and she married into the Stokes family. And as you saw from the previous slide, it's a very tiny town, very tiny area that they were from. And so everybody married everyone. And so even though I don't think that I'm biologically related to Angela Bassett because she's a direct Stokes descendant, we do share cousins. And so that's how, that is my connection. That is my claim to fame to Angela Bassett. Okay. So now what we're going to do is just a very simple exercise. I think Dr. Dyer told you that you could have your pen and paper and hopefully you're taking notes, and we're going to show you just a very basic way to start to create a family tree just based on information that you might already have. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my whiteboard, and we're going to start with, you're going to start with yourself. So here I'm going to start with me, and I'm just going to put my name here. And you'll put your name in as the starting point. Then you're just going to, I can do it here. Draw a line this way, and then draw a line that way. And here's where you would put your parent. So you're just going to put your father, and leave the last name off, but his name's Robinson. And I'm going to put my mother's name, and her name was Mamie. And I always put in the, always make sure that you include the maiden name for the women, because that's how you're going to trace them on that side. Most women go by their married names, but that last name is not their family name. So you always want to include the women's maiden names when you're doing your family history. And so you can go back one more generation if you want. Let's go back to my father's father, who was also Pliny. And so you're going to build your tree like that. If you know your grandparents, this would be where they would go. And so for the sake of time, I'm not going to build the whole thing out, but I actually can go to several generations back by now. I just put my grandmother here because I don't want to forget her. And she was Susie Watts Robinson. So you always want to include the surnames when you're building the tree of the. Okay, hopefully I can go back and get my slideshow here and share that. So I'm just going to show you my own personal family tree here. That's my paternal grandmother, Susie Robinson, my maternal grandmother, Mamie Jackson Haynes, my father, my mother you saw in the tree, me, my 4 children, Chelsea, Maria, Melvin, and Patricia. And then this is our newest addition, Camilla. This is my granddaughter. And so when you build your tree, this is what the finished product is going to look like. So how many people, I'm just going to ask the audience, how many people know the names of both their grandparents on both sides, their mother's side and their father's side? Okay. How many people can go back to their great-grandparents, one side or the other? And how many people can go back to their great-great-grandparents? One side or the other, or both sides? Excellent. Okay, that's wonderful. So when you're doing genealogy, you want to start with your, I always think, the oldest members in your family, because of course we know they have less time. And so like Dr. Dyer said, going, wishing that he had been able to sit down and talk to his grandmother and get those stories and get that information from her. So it's very important to go back and get those older members when you have the opportunity and get the stories from them and try to get the basic information, where they were born, when they were born, what they did for a living, those kinds of questions. Get the basics first, and then go into more in-depth questions about the times and what was going on and things like that. And the reason you want to get those basic questions, because those are the things that you will be able to document and find documents about. Okay. And so I have these pictures up here because these represent where the Robinson family split. On the left, you see myself, and this is my cousin Mickey. We're actually first cousins. And on the Robinson side, and as you saw on that one document, the previous slide, we are descendants of Tobias Robinson. Now, Tobias is where the family split. And you can see here, this is my cousin Lily, and she's on the other side of the Robinson family. So it split, and you had a black branch of the Robinson family, and you had a white branch of the Robinson family. And so Lily is from the white branch of the Robinson family, and we're from the black branch of the Robinson family. So we're talking about genealogy. So of course we're going to talk about documents. Here is the census. So a lot of people know about the census, and the importance of the census is so that you can go back and find your ancestors and find your history. So always make sure to fill out that census information. This is from the 1880 census, Brooks County, and this is actually my great-grandfather, Aaron Robinson. You can see that it'll give you the age, it gives you the race, and shows that they had one son at the time. He was 20, my great-grandmother was 19, and they had one son. And this is my grandfather's brother right here. Another document that you can use to find information is a death certificate. This is my grandfather, actually my grandfather's death certificate. And what you will see here is if you know, for example, your grandparents, but you don't know your great-grandparents, this kind of document will provide that information for you. So you can see here, this is the name of his father, Aaron Robinson, his mother, and then also his wife, my grandmother, Susie Robinson. Also will give you where he's buried. So where a person is buried, that will be on a death certificate. Also the cause of death, which might be important for people if they're interested in health information based on what happens in their family or what might run in their family. Now, this is actually a marriage license. So the marriage license will also have important information on there. This is actually a Pennsylvania license. And I did not know, this is my cousin, Samuel Thomas. He was born in Georgia, but he moved to McKeesport. And he lived in McKeesport for many years. He lived to 103. So he was there when I was there. But unfortunately, I did not know that I was part of his family at the time until after he had passed away. And you see his occupation, you see where he was born, so that gives you some of that information. Also, you see his parents' names. So that is another document that can help you find a previous generation. Another source of information that you can use is newspapers. This is an article about my great-grandfather and how he died, and this was from 1896. He died at 36. As you can see here, they called him a highly respected Negro farmer, and he was accidentally shot and killed. He set his gun down, and something jolted the gun, and the gun went off and apparently hit him in the chest and killed him at the age of 36. And this is a list of resources. I use Ancestry.com. I have a membership there. They do give you a free trial. And the reason I like Ancestry, because it has a lot of the databases there that you can access in one place. Another source is MyHeritage, Family Search. These are some free ones I've listed here, newspapers.com. But some of the free resources that you can use are local libraries, the National Archives, which is free, and then also your parents and grandparents' homes, your aunts and uncles, because especially if people lived in their homes for a long time, they're going to have documents there. They're going to have military discharge papers. They're going to have newspaper articles of things that family members have done or been involved with. They're going to have maybe family Bibles. You know, back in the day, people used to write down the names of their family and family Bibles. And so all those things are resources that are free, that you don't have to sign up to get a membership for. That is the end of my presentation. I hope that it's been enlightening to you, or that you've had some, that it's been helpful in some kind of way. If anyone has any questions, they can email me. I have my email address here that I use just for genealogy purposes. is genealogyafricana@gmail.com. And thank everyone for their participation, and thank Dr. Dyer for the opportunity.
All right, thanks. Thank you so much, Monica. So yeah, there's a wealth of information to be found in genealogy, but as Ms. Hayes told us, just be prepared for what you find. And next we're going to come to Ms. Lucretia Wembley. So when you do find information, she's going to help us figure out how to pull it all together and start to build stories from it. And so we're going to ask Nan at this point if she can help us bring up, thank you, Nan. This is a portion of Lucretia's information she's going to share. So Lucretia, we're going to turn it over to you.
All right. Hi, guys, and thank you, Irv. So once again, guys, my name is Lucretia Wembley, and I am a breaking news reporter at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Now, on a typical day, I tend to cover like a wide range of things, from crime and cops to court reporting to fun feature stories and obituaries. But one of my favorite things to cover is feature stories or biographies, or basically stories where I get to truly capture a person's life, right? So I'm super excited to give you guys a very simple format that you can use when writing your loved one's stories, okay? So we just heard from Monica on how to access all of these genealogy records and how to interview family members and others in order to write the story of your relative or your loved one. But what do you do with all of this information, right? And how do you craft all of these details into a story that is well organized and digestible by readers? Like, where do you even start? You know, trust me, guys, I totally get it, okay? Having all of this information from your relative's genealogy, their family history, combined with their educational background, interviews with relatives, colleagues, and former friends, it's all super overwhelming, okay? But I'm gonna start by briefly walking you through a framework that I use to write a very basic biography about an incredible radio personality who founded WYEP FM's Soul Show in the 1990s. Let's see. All right, yeah, and his name is Stephen Chapman, okay? And he was basically a radio personality with a superb knowledge of music, according to listeners and those who knew him. And he was not only well respected among his colleagues, but he was also a major influence to the youth in the different parts of Pittsburgh. So I had the opportunity to write about Mr. Chapman after he passed away in March, unfortunately due to the coronavirus, like so many others in recent months. But I do want to note that one difference for you guys is that you will be writing about your family members and loved ones who you'll likely know more personally or have more of a familial tie to than I did Mr. Chapman, but we will essentially follow the same protocol, okay? We'll get back to my brief example about Mr. Chapman in just a second. So the first thing I want you to do before you start chiseling away and trying to craft a story is something that I created. It's called the 4 W's checklist, right? So basically you're gonna write out your information, and it's gonna help you pick apart all of those overwhelming details. So first you're gonna write down who, you know, where, what, and what, okay? Who, where, what, and what. And I would encourage you guys to take notes as you're following along here. I have some basic slides that I'll show you as we go along, but take notes, guys, and I'll try to keep it very basic and simple for you guys to understand. Okay, so the first thing you'll write down on your checklist is who are you writing about, right? So this includes basic identifying details such as their name, their age, their birth date, and any other basic identifying information. And this also includes their commonly known habits or personality traits that stand out and essentially made them who they are, right? Like, what were their favorite songs? You know, what were their favorite TV shows, places they like to visit, things they were passionate about doing. And you would have learned all of this from your own personal knowledge of them, as well as from the various interviews that you conducted with family members, friends, and like colleagues. And so that's our first W, right? The second W on your checklist that's gonna help you, you know, chisel away and break apart all of this information that you have is where, okay? Where do they come from? and who do they come from, as a side note. And this means to consider what city or town they grew up in. And it's also where you'll briefly engage their genealogy, like Monica just shared with us, and the type of family they come from. Who were their ancestors, and what was significant about those who came before them, and what was significant about the times that their ancestors lived in, right? And even more importantly, did their ancestors have any play in who they, this particular relative that you're writing about, who they became, the person that they became? And also, did they look up to any of their previous relatives? You know, you're gonna put it all down here next to your second W on your checklist, okay? So the third W on your checklist is what, okay? What is most significant about their life or their life's accomplishments? Now, next to this W on your checklist, you'll want to pick apart those mounds of information that you have and focus in on the history of their education, like including schools they went to or any major accolades or awards that they won. And this also includes significant creations or inventions or other accomplishments from their lifetime. And you should also, guys, think about their strengths and weaknesses and anything that they've had to overcome during their life. You're gonna wanna put all of this down next to what on your checklist, okay? Now, the fourth W on the checklist is what, again, but what do you want people to most remember about this particular family member or loved one, you know, or ancestor that you're writing about? You know, what should people remember most about them? Was it simply the loving person that they were to others that made them stand out, you know, or was it some of their significant accomplishments in life? You know, it's up to you to decide. And this is very important, as it's likely what you'll use to begin your story and craft what we call a lead, basically the very beginning of the story or the first sentence in the story. And it's the detail that will stand out as a thing that draws readers in and essentially captures the major takeaway from that person's life, okay? So that was the 4 W's on your checklist, right? And just to recap, this is going to help you organize and begin to pick apart all of those overwhelming details and facts and genealogy records and history, and you know, it's going to help you basically get a visual of what you're working with. Let's see. All right, so now I'll get back into my example of the way I wrote Mr. Chapman's story. So as I was writing Mr. Chapman's story, I had my 4 W's laid out, right? And so number 1, I'm going to walk you through my 4 W's for Mr. Chapman. Then I'll briefly engage you about how I started that story, how I began to work the lead of that story, so that you can have something to have an example of how you can begin to craft your story. So number 1, for my first W, I knew that his name is Stephen Chapman. He's 55 years old. He's from the Pittsburgh area, spent the last decade or so of his life in Arizona. And I know that he was most notoriously known for his charismatic personality, as well as the founding of the Soul Show at WYEP-FM, the radio station here in the Hill District of Pittsburgh, which he co-founded with his best friend, Don Patterson. And I know that this show still continues to date. So those are just basic identifying information. Next to the first W on my checklist is who am I writing about, right? For the second W on my checklist, I know that he is one of his most significant accomplishments is, in fact, forming the Soul Show at WYEP-FM, especially and most significantly during a time when the radio station did not play much of any soulful music at all. So Mr. Chapman essentially expanded the culture at the radio station, and listeners definitely responded. So that's my second W for how I was picking apart the information that I had on Mr. Chapman. For the third W on my checklist, I know that Mr. Chapman comes from an incredible community, which he gave back to quite often. His best friend, Don Patterson, gave me tons of information and insightful knowledge about the type of person Mr. Chapman was, and also the way people responded to him who came into contact with him. And his former colleagues at the radio station were also very helpful in giving me information in this regard. So the interviews, so I'm referring to the interviews I did with colleagues and his best friend here. And he was also super helpful to the kids in the community, namely Damon Young. I had the opportunity to interview him, and he told me about how Mr. Chapman created small jobs for the kids in the community in East Liberty, and how he would, just give them little volunteer opportunities, stuff like that. It was seemingly small things, but these are very important details that really shows who Mr. Chapman was, right? So I could not directly reach family members for this particular story because the death was super fresh and the family was just beginning to grieve, but for you guys, you will be definitely using genealogy records and definitely interviewing the family members of your loved ones and within your family for whoever you're writing about. And for this particular story also, I did not access genealogy records for the sake of time because this was like a news obituary type story. But in this regard, I guess for you guys, I definitely learned a lot about the community he came from and where he came from through the people that I talked to who knew him well and knew him best. Okay, and so for the fourth W on my checklist, as I'm writing Mr. Chapman's story, I knew that his loved ones and colleagues and people that knew him wanted people to most remember the stamp or mark he left here in radio in Pittsburgh, right? So namely at the WYEP FM radio station. That's what was most significant and what people seem to want, or seemed what people really highlighted the most about his life. Okay. So with all of my 4 W's laid out, how in the world did I even begin to craft the story? Well, let me tell you, there is a format that you can use, and it's called the inverted pyramid story structure style, which is basically an ancient story structure formats that journalists have used forever, since the dinosaurs roamed, basically. It's old, and some people even today are trying to come up with different ways to tell stories, but I'm gonna share this example with you guys because it's super simple and it's the easy format that you can use. So with the inverted pyramid story structure style, you want to place the most important or significant details about the person that you're writing about at the top of your story. And then you will add supporting facts and key quotes from relatives, friends, family members, anyone that you've interviewed that has striking quotes that really stand out to you. You'll want to list that higher up too underneath your lead. And so underneath that, then you'll add your background from their genealogy records, the family history, the educational history, and other accomplishments that you've come across. This also includes detailing what the times were like, if that's relevant to what you're writing about, or if it's relevant to that person significantly. And lastly, on the inverted pyramid style, you will want to list more towards the end of your story those who knew him, those who knew the person, or other additional information or quotes or details. You want to list that on down towards the end of your story as you're winding your story down. Okay, and guys, this format will help you so much just beginning to get some structure to the story you're writing, okay, to the biography that you're writing. So I'll give you guys an example. So the way I began the story on Mr. Chapman was with a simple sentence, right? So I said, Stephen Chapman brought the attitude, the funk, and the style WYEP-FM was missing in the 1990s, okay? And I'm gonna say that one more time. Stephen Chapman brought the attitude, the funk, and the style that WYEP-FM was missing in the 1990s. So that essentially captured the third and fourth W from my checklist, right? Which is what is most significant about the person's life and their accomplishments, and what people should remember most about them, right? So I built upon that in the following paragraph, which is the second step of sorts on our inverted pyramid structure, by adding supporting facts of how Mr. Chapman came to start the Soul Show, right? So this supports what I stated in my lead, and which is what essentially captures a major mark for Mr. Chapman's life. So in the supporting facts and the next step of our inverted pyramid structure, I said with his best friend of 30 years, Don Patterson, Mr. Chapman co-founded the Soul Show in July 1995 at WYAP's studio in the Hill District. Colleagues and friends say he set the stage for the show's success and his knowledgeable insight into music and infectious humor. The show was a blast of the 1970s, the 80s, and 90s nostalgia, according to colleagues who worked with him. So that's just an example of how I basically began to craft a story. But I hope that you guys could follow along with that and kind of see how I basically created my checklist, and then I began to chisel away using the inverted pyramid story structure. So I continue to build upon this by following the inverted pyramid story structure style. And I added quotes from friends and colleagues, and those who knew him remembered him from childhood, like Damon Young. And they told me information about his favorite music, the songs that he liked, you know, the music that he was passionate about, which is a major mark in his life and who he was, and the people that he inspired. And I also included, continued to break down in the story, the inverted pyramid structure, the city and community that he's from, and you know where he spent the last moments of his life, stuff like that, and so on and so forth. So, guys, I hope that this was super helpful to you as you begin to write your biographies and write the stories of your loved ones or your ancestors that you are researching. And so just to recap really quick, I'm just going to tell you, take a moment and breathe after you have all of these mounds of information, right? Breathe. It's going to be okay. I promise you can do it. Writing is a tedious job, but you know, you can get through it, okay? So one, you'll just want to create your 4 W's checklist. You'll want to write down, one, who are you writing about? You know, who is this person? Number 2, where and who do they come from? You know, 3, what is most significant about their life or their life's achievements? And 4, what should people remember most about them, right? And from there, you'll want to just follow the inverted pyramid story structure style and just begin chiseling away and crafting your stories from the 4 W's that you laid out. And that's all, guys. I hope this was super helpful to you.
Thank you so much, Lucretia. And now we're going to move to, so as she mentioned, before we move to Allegra Battle, as Lucretia mentioned, if you find a friend or a family member who's talkative and chatty, it's a gift to your storytelling, because that's going to give you so much detail that you can use to build a story and a biography of the person's life. Now we're going to move to Allegra Battle, and Allegra is going to share with us some ideas about how to use audiovisual storytelling, but also how to think about different ways that we can tell stories. And so, Allegra, we're going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dyer. I really appreciate it. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Some very, very exciting information. Let me put my glasses on so I can look like I know what I'm talking about and I can see. So I'm talking today about storytelling ideas and ways you can capture your family stories through audio, through poetry, through art, and so much more. The possibilities are totally limitless. And then if you want to go to the next slide. So like I said, there are so many ways to tell your family stories. And first, you should start by thinking about what kind of story you would like to tell. That's how you can choose about how you want to bring your family story to life. The first one is family history. We talk about Alex Haley and the Roots experience. Also, we heard from Harold Hayes at the beginning of this presentation. His telling of his family story was his whole family history. So telling the story of multiple generations over an extended time. A personal history, telling the stories of an individual or a small group of family members, similar to the example we just had from Lucretia, and also the way Dr. Dyer spoke so eloquently about his grandmother growing up. If he would choose to tell a story about her, that would be an example of a personal history storytelling. And then you have historical history, telling your family story through the lens of an historical time. Think of the first woman to do this or the first Black man to do that. Harold had a little bit of that in his family tree as well. So did Monica. Me thinking about myself personally, my mother was a founder of the 5% in New York City. So, and I just actually read a piece about her in a New York magazine, telling about her experience as this woman. So those are 3 ways you can tell your family history. So think about ways how you want to remember your family history or tell your family story. And like I said, they're limitless, but these are just 3 examples. Nan, if we want to move to the next slide. Okay. All right. So now we're going to get into ways you can tell your family stories. It's important to become a witness to the unique and beautiful stories of Africana people because our stories are so unique and so beautiful, not taking away from anyone else's stories, but as a person of Africana descent, just the history alone, the American Black history story, the history of Africans, enslaved Africans, it's so rich, it's so ingrained with so much that it's important to be a witness to these stories and keep these stories alive. As Harold mentioned, Monica, Lucretia, Dr. Dyer mentioned, as African Americans or Black Americans in America, it's sometimes hard to get our family history because of the transatlantic slave trade and some of the other things that happened where we were not even marked as humans. So going back to find great-great-grandmother or someone even beyond that might not be so easy to go look into the census records or, because they weren't necessarily marked with their names, So those are some things to think about as well when you're crafting these stories. So one of the first ways we can tell our family stories is through audio and video. And so like Dr. Dyer mentioned, I am an audio journalist. I have been for over 20 years. And one of my favorite things to do is to tell stories. And I've been telling stories about Africana people with Dr. Dyer in Haiti, also in Europe, in Germany, in Brussels, and even here in America. So some ways you can tell those stories through audio is oral histories, talking to your grandparents. You can even do that now. One thing that I recently did was save all of my mother's voicemails that she sent to me. And I'm creating a story around those. Audio stories. An example was Harold's story, even though it was a visual presentation, that could have been turned into an audio presentation as well. And also a documentary, similar to the way that Alex Haley did in Roots with his movie. Then of course we have written narratives, similar to what Lucretia gave us an example of. Those can be in the form of essays, books, poetry. Just think about how beautiful it would be to tell the story of a loved one or tell the story of your family through poetry. Also visual art, paintings, murals, photography. I love a good coffee table book full of photographs that people can just look through. Telling your family story through photographs and making a coffee table book, that is a way to do that as well. Then we get into some performance art, dance, song, plays, and dramatic presentations. Dance, think of Alvin Ailey and the wonderful way that he is remembered when anyone performs, a company performs his dances or his choreographies. Songs, think of a Whitney Houston tribute, BET and the Grammys, they love to give those tributes, but those are ways to tell stories as well. Plays and dramatic presentations, I think one of the greatest examples we have of that is our own, Pittsburgh's own August Wilson. His stories and his plays were a narrative and a history of Black America, no doubt about it. And so then we think about some other ways, recipe and cookbooks. We have a great example of that a little bit later in my presentation, But taking those recipes that your grandmother or mother or great great grandmother or father passed down to you, that is a way to keep that legacy and that rich tradition of the foods they liked and the foods they ate, is a way of telling a story as well. Community and family quilts. An idea I really, really love is making a quilt for a baby in your family. You know, like Monica has a brand new grandbaby. Wouldn't it be great to take items from that baby's grandparents and parents and great grandparents and make them into a quilt a day where everyone can come together to do that? And also, and last on the list is home restoration. A lot of times we have family homes that are left to people in our families. Restoring those homes to their former glory, that's a way of honoring and telling a story. If you don't have a full house, maybe you have a piece of furniture. In my family, there is a dresser that has been passed down to a few of my aunts. Keeping that dresser restored to the way it looked as when it was sitting in my great great grandmother's home. You know, those are ways to honor and tell stories, family stories as well. We want to move on to the next slide, man. Okay, so now here's the fun part. The process of getting this story or getting these ideas together. The first thing we want to do is choose, just like in our previous slide. Choose what kind of story you want to tell. What and who do you need to tell that story? Do you need, documentation from the census? Do you need pictures? Do you need audio? Like I said, I saved my mother's voicemail messages. Get those things together, things you would need to tell your story. Arrange your data and facts to formulate your story. It's very important, especially, I know Monica will talk about this in our question and answer portion, but when you are going down those roads, looking for, your family history and your genealogy, it's important to keep those things compartmentalized and in order. And the same process is true when you are trying to put together a story, the way you want to tell this information that you have. And then how are you going to tell your story with the information you have? What are some ways you can do that? Next is to present it. Do you want to present or share your story with an audience? Think about that. And when will you present your story? How long will it take? Those are also things to think about when you're thinking about how you want to honor and capture the memories of your family or family members. Okay. And now, since like I said, I am an audio journalist, so I'm going to just briefly speak on crafting an audio story specifically. So, equipment. For anything that you do, you don't have to have any fancy equipment to do anything. We all know this is the age of, having everything on our cell phones, and we can shoot video on our cell phones. We can even grab audio with our cell phones. You don't have to have a lot to do something. So for audio stories, most smartphones already come with pretty good audio recording apps built in. But if not, you can go and get free apps or 99-cent apps, anything to get good quality. And most of them on the market produce pretty good quality. Portable audio recorders can also be used, the fancy ones, of course. What to capture? Now, here's the fun part. So as a storyteller, I love, as an audio storyteller, I love when I'm able to make an audio story be visual. And what I mean by that is I love for a listener to hear my audio story and they can feel and see and taste and smell all of the things that I experienced when I was there getting the information for the story. So you want to capture your surroundings. If you're going to interview your grandmother, what type of day is it outside? I'm looking outside my window right now, excuse me, and I see it's kind of breezy, the trees are blowing, it's sunny outside. So how can I capture those things with natural sound? So I would take my recorder and get just a little bit of that natural wind blowing. I see birds, getting some of that bird chirping sound. There are ways you can get sound to tell a visual story. So getting that natural sound on tape is really important. Next is your interview style. When you talk to these family members about themselves or about other people in your family, you always want to ask open questions, meaning you want to avoid yes or no answers. So, grandma, so you grew up in the South? Yes, baby. So that's great. We know that. But a better question would be, grandma, how was it growing up in the South? Oh, well, and then she would go on to tell you that. And you want to ask people to describe how they were feeling at a particular time. So your grandma's telling you about how she grew up in the South and, how schools were segregated. So grandma, how did you feel? What did it feel like to go into a classroom and you were the only Black person there? Or what did it feel like, being in a room as the only woman or the only man? What did that sound like? What did it smell like, taste like? Those are all things you can ask your subject to formulate a really good audio story. And like I said, we want to make the story as visual as possible. So those are just some tips of crafting an audio story, but those can also be used if you want to do a written story, if you want to do poetry, a song. It can all be crafted for that. So we're going to go on to our last slide of examples of Africana family storytelling. So the first one is a cookbook from 2017 by author Michael W. Twitty. And he is a chef and an author. And the book is called The Cooking Gene, A Journey Through African American Culinary History in the Old South. And so what Michael was able to do is take some of these recipes that were passed down from slavery to Black American culture and really take those recipes and explain how and why the people ate the way they ate and things like that. So that was important. So it's a cookbook, but it's also a history book. And one of the things that he did as he was doing this and documenting it is that he dressed as his ancestors would have dressed when they would have cooked these foods. So as you see on the screen, his outfit relates to that. Next is a great example of a Pittsburgh artist, and it was called Flow State, and it was performed by Shaquille Douglas and a friend of mine named Tara Faye, and this was a great piece of performance art. And so what the two women did, they went into a gallery, Dina Lawson's photographic exhibit at the Carnegie Museum, and Tara went in and got her hair braided, and the photographs around her were of Black women. So this, if you are an African American person or a Black woman, or Black women, or was raised by a Black woman, you know the importance of hair, and especially hair braiding, and how that is so significant in Black American culture, and the idea of another woman braiding another woman's hair. That is storytelling, and that is family storytelling. So that was a great way of performance art. And we see in that picture, that beautiful picture there was taken by Sarah Young, Honey Young, and she is another friend of mine, and also Howard. We were in Howard together, Howard Bison. So that picture right there, taken by a Black woman, is another example of storytelling. And so my final example is a great, great children's book, but it's really for everyone. It's a folklore book from 1985 called The People Could Fly, American Black Folk Tales by the author Virginia Hamilton. And what Hamilton did was she took a collection of 24 fairy tales and folklores and stories about Africans and Black Americans, and just put them together. So you're thinking like, of course, fairy tales aren't real, but Dr. Dyer would would say otherwise, that they are based on reality. But how is that storytelling, family storytelling? If you think about in your own family, we all have stories that were passed down from generation to generation. And folklore is the same way. If you know a people's folklore or things that they believe, you know a people. So that's why I think this is a great example of Africana family storytelling. So those are just some ideas to get you guys started. Again, I really appreciate everyone being here today. And yes, if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them.
All right, so thank you very much, Allegra. As we prepare to take your questions, I'm going to ask that all the panelists come back up on screen. I want to keep you muted so that we're all speaking at once and we're not getting echoes, but I want you back on the screen. If our attendees would be prepared to send their questions in. As we do that, I want to say a couple of things. I'm going to take opportunity to offer a commercial here. So one of the things that we're interested in with Africana family storytelling is not just family telling about the African American experience, right? But we're really interested in the sort of Africana storytelling experience across the globe. And to that end, I work with a young woman in the Washington, D.C. area. We have a storytelling opportunity to take travelers to Haiti, to Cuba, and other places where we go into community to tell the stories of the Africana experience across the globe. And so if you're interested in joining us on one of those experiences, you can reach out to me. We'll take you into some really wonderful opportunities, some engaging experiences, to tell stories of our brothers and sisters who are outside of America, but have really wonderful lives and passions, and you can explore that as well. So now we're going to open it up to your questions. And I think first thing this morning, I got a question from a woman by the name of Sandra. So we're going to try to find her question, and then we're going to put that to our panel, okay? So Sandra, I know you sent me your question. Let me see if we can find it in the chat or in the question, and we'll put it to our panel. Yeah, so Sandy wants to know, where do you start when you don't have a proper surname? She says her mother was born in 1928, but her birth certificate wasn't issued until she was 14 years old. She was raised by a distant relative. There were names on the birth certificate, and that she was raised as an only child. So what suggestions might there be for Sandy to try to track down information on her mother? She was born in 28. She doesn't have a proper surname, and her birth certificate wasn't issued until she was 14 years old. What might be some things that she can do? And Monica, we might put this to you, and then we'll open it up if other panelists have suggestions of what she might do.
Okay. Well, that's an excellent question, Sandy. And I know it's very tough when you are not born into your or not raised by, birth relatives. I think the question did state that she was raised, that your mom was raised by distant relatives. I would see if you could track down some of those descendants of those relatives, see who might still be alive, who might still be around, that might have some information regarding your mom. They might be able to tell you what her name was before the birth certificate, or the name that's on the birth certificate. They might be able to give you some information about that if you can track down some of those people from your extended family.
Anyone else have suggestions for Sandy? All right. And are there other questions? I saw Sandy's question, but I don't see other questions. Are there other attendees who have questions? You can raise your hand or send your question into the chat, and we'll try to answer them while we're online.
I know as we were listening to some of the other presentations, there was a question from someone about, are there any reliable websites that would help look up people of Native American ancestry? And I do not know the answer to that. Maybe some of the rest of you do, but in looking over my own history and that narrative I had from my Aunt Hilda, apparently my great-grandmother, paternal great-grandmother, was an indentured servant who my great-grandfather purchased her freedom. And it said in this narrative that her mother was Native American. So I'm assuming my paternal great-grandmother was Native American as well. But I remember in looking up as much as I could about them, the record was not easily found. So maybe some of the other panelists could answer that question about Native American ancestry and where to really look for reliable information there.
I would suggest perhaps if you know the area, going to the reservations. I would think that maybe there would be records there at the reservations, or either in the states, perhaps that the reservation may be in.
I was going to suggest also that if you can narrow it down to, do you have a specific Native American group? Because there are so many, and that's why it's difficult if you don't have a specific group. I know in my family, on my mother's side, we have cousins. I don't know if it's through our bloodline, but I know that we have cousins who are Native American, and they are from Delaware. I can't recall the tribe right now. And they have a huge presence in Delaware. They have a museum there. I read my cousin's obituary. It had, you know, information in there about their Native ancestry. So and with African Americans, it's very difficult, because if you haven't had that part of the culture handed down to you, it's very hard to trace. Some people, fortunately, were able to hand that portion down through stories and things like that. And so you're able to trace that, because just to say Native American, that's such a huge, huge group. Native Americans, you know, exist from North America, you know, up through Canada, through the United States, Central America, South America. All of those are actually Native American people. And so when you don't have a specific group, it's very hard to narrow it down. Even if you do DNA, if you don't have a large percentage per se of Native American DNA, you won't be able to narrow the group down even that way, because it's just going to tell you you have, you know, 1%, 3%, 5%, and it's not going to give you that, you know, that indigenous group, that tribe, or whatever you want to refer to them as. It's not going to be able to give it to you,
right?
If you don't have a large enough percentage of Native American blood. But there are websites that can give you some of the history, if you can narrow down like Allegra said, the location, the state, the community. I know on my one family I work with, their roots are in Sugarlock, Mississippi. And so they're always talking about the possibility of there being Native American, because there wasn't a large Native American presence, and actually Sugarlock is a Native American word. And so that's a specific region that you can research to find out about the Native Americans there and their connections to African Americans. If you can as much as you can narrow it down, it's going to help.
Right. Thank you.
And some of our attendees also have recommended that locally, the Heinz History Center here may have resources as well to help connect Native American and African American sort of genealogical tools or information. So check with your local historical society. I think a lot of communities now are recognizing that that there are historical gaps and cultural gaps in how we research history, and are trying to provide resources to help people fill those gaps. So check with your local libraries, check with your local history centers, and see the information that they can get and lead you to. Also, again, search online. There's a wealth of information that might be present online that you can possibly have access to. Like Monica talked about, if you know a particular sort of Native American community that you are attached to, try to get to that reservation, have some conversations there, see what you can dig up. But so the local institutions, local historical institutions, see if there are affinity groups online, and then just try to take it from there. Are there any other questions? I'm seeing some of the attendees respond, and okay. So here's the question. It says, my grandfather's name is Reverend Mordecai Calvin Battle. He lived in the Houston, Galveston area. I'd like to know if Allegra Battle has a family history on her Battle family. We have a lot of history in the family, and I'd like to know if she would like to connect.
Well, awesome. So my father is the Battle side, and the only thing I know about them is that they are from Mississippi, or from down south, from that area. So of course, yes, I would love to connect to find out, because I don't know much about that side of my family. Well, I do know, I mean, other than my grandfather, his name is James Battle. But I do know that if there is an S on the Battles, that we are not related. But if there is not an S, it's like 65% that we are related. So yes, thank you. I would love to be related to someone named Dr. Mordecai. That's an awesome name.
Yes, it's Reverend Mordecai Calvin Battle.
Yes, Reverend Mordecai.
Reverend Mordecai, exactly. And also, Salahuddin, who's also online, reminds us that Ancestry.com has a program called Fold3, Fold3, the number 3, which has collected military data for all the wars. And so perhaps if you have a relative who participated in the service, you can go there to try to find information on their life and their time in the service.
Yes, that's an excellent resource. I've used Fold3. I have that level of Ancestry membership. I just moved up to that level, which gives you access to Fold3 as well. You can have a separate membership for Fold3, or you can have a higher level membership in Ancestry that will give you access to Fold3 and also access to newspapers.com, where you can find articles as well. I think in Fold3, I found information about one of my great-great-grandparents who was actually in the Civil War.
Yeah, Ancestry.com's helped me quite a bit. I've found a lot of the census records and even death records. It told me a lot of things that I didn't know, and a lot of relevant information. The other thing you come away with, though, and Monica, you know this, and we all kind of alluded to it, Ancestry.com is not a benevolent organization. You can find stuff there, but depending on what you're looking for, you have to pay. But it's been very helpful. Matter of fact, I mentioned that my father and many of his brothers came up to the New Homestead area and worked in several of them worked in the brick yards down in where Sandcastle is now, the refractory Harbison Walker. And you look at many of their death certificates, and several of them died of respiratory diseases, including my father. He had finished working for them in 1951 and had a ministry until 1962, but died of lobar pneumonia. And several of my uncles, when I look at their death certificates, their respiratory ailments. And of course, the times they were working there were not during the era of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. So Lord only knows what they were, breathing in. But those are things that you can find through Ancestry.com and death certificates, as several of our panelists have said.
Yeah, absolutely. I think here's a question for Lucretia. It may be from a relative. She says, Lucretia, I know that you've written about your family history before, but have you had the chance to look into it in depth?
That's a good question. So I wrote a very brief story about about growing up in the foster system. And I basically was just, in that particular story, was just detailing my experience from the lens of being a child and what I experienced in the foster system. But I am just now beginning the process of trying to find out where I come from. I'm just beginning the process, guys, so I don't have much information to give you, unfortunately, but I will tell you this, that I'm from Memphis, Tennessee, so I'm working with the Tennessee Department of Children's Services right now to locate my birth mother. So that's where I'm at right now. And trust me, more stories will be coming the more I walk through this and the more that this unfolds. And so I'm actually a Robinson too, like Monica. So my maiden name, before I was adopted, my last name was Robinson. So now it's Wembley, obviously. But yeah, so thanks for asking that, though. That was a good question. That's where I'm at right now. So.
Excellent. You can do it. I just want to offer you encouragement to continue your search, Lucretia, because I too was raised in a foster care system, and fortunately I got to stay with my foster parents for my most of my growing up life.
Yeah.
18, so I went away to college, so I didn't have to move around to a lot of different homes the way some people have. But the benefit of being in the foster care system and not adopted is that you do have access to your birth certificate, whereas people who are adopted, they lock those away, and they don't like to give people access to their birth certificate so that you can find who your biological parents are. But you know your biological parents? Oh, you're on mute.
I was in the foster system for maybe 6 to 8 years, and then I was adopted. But I stayed with a host family of sorts for like five of those years. But me and my sister still belong to the Tennessee, until the adoption was finalized. And we were actually passed around to a few different homes and stayed in a group home for maybe like a year to a year and a half before we were fostered and then officially adopted. So I actually had to finagle with Tennessee Department of Children's Services to get those records unsealed, because it was like a lot of mailing back and forth. And yeah, I actually just got my adoption records unsealed back in February, finally, after a couple months of mailing back and forth with them. And so I know what happened with the adoption. I have like juvenile court records and all of this stuff, I have my original birth certificate, all of that stuff now. And so, just one step at a time, because it's a process.
Yeah, it is. It's a lot.
So,
yeah. Thank you, Monica, though. I appreciate that.
Speaking of it being a process for Harold and Monica, and maybe even Lucretia, can you talk about the investment of time and the investment of other resources that it has taken you to uncover your family histories? Because I know for Monica in particular, and Harold, you can speak to this as well, I know Monica has been doing it for a number of years. And so can you give people who are interested the sense of investment, how much time it, and perhaps other kind of resources, financial resources to do some travel, to tap into some of the websites? What is the investment that a person might expect to make to pursue some of these family histories?
Well, just to condense it, that 7-minute video I had, that information didn't come to me in 7 minutes. It started in the 1980s. And that narration I had about my mother and all the places she worked, I found that resume she wrote about a month ago. So over the course of 20 or 30 years, that took 30 years to get that 7 minutes. And none of it comes immediately. It comes through time. But sometimes on our family vacation, if I'm going through Virginia, then I'd stop at the Virginia Library in Richmond or something, or go through Lynchburg and look and see where Thomas and Cora Hayes lived and all that. So I don't even know what money was spent, but it was overtime, and none of it happens quickly. It just happens over time.
Yes, I would agree with Harold in terms of my journey. Man, it's been, yeah, it goes into decades before you know it. And in my particular case, I was studying, I was researching my father's family, which I thought was from Richmond, Virginia. I thought that was my father. And so when I came to Richmond, I started to visit all the places that I had seen on the census where my grandparents and my great-grandparents lived. And I had even, when I was still in Pittsburgh, traveled to Richmond, Virginia to talk to my dad's brother. He had one brother left, and Uncle Harold, and talked to him, and I had written all of that. And then, as I said, when I did the DNA, and that's why I always tell people you have to be ready. When I did the DNA and started to pay attention to the matches, I realized that all that research and everything I had done was on the wrong family. That my father was not my biological father. And then, you know, I had to start the search all over again to try to find who my biological father was. Fortunately, it didn't take me as long because of the DNA. And so DNA is a very useful tool. There are people that have concerns about, you know, security, privacy, what people do with the DNA, and things like that. And so really, before you do it, I would ask people to research that and make sure that you're comfortable, you know, with taking that DNA test with Ancestry or 23andMe or whatever, you know, entity you want to take it with. But if you are comfortable with that, it will take you to the next level. And as I showed you on the slides, you know, there's 2 branches of where our Robinson family veers off. And I would venture to guess that is, especially for African Americans, that's going to be very common. I mean, I'm guessing probably every family has that split when you're talking historically. I'm not talking about modern times where people chose, you know, partners that they want to be with. You're talking about historically where people, you know, were exploited, especially African American women. And so every family that I've researched up to date, there has been that split where you've had, you know, this white branch and the black branch of that family. But in terms of the research, yeah, it takes years. It takes, in terms of money, I can't even count. I probably could sit here and calculate how much money I've just given to Ancestry alone in the monthly membership fee for like over 20 years. Somebody could probably calculate that. But it just depends on how determined you are you know, how important it is to you to do it. And, you know, people will invest in that if that's something that's important to them.
All right, so we have a couple more questions. So this one comes from Salah Udin, and he says that he's been banging his head against a brick wall trying to find his paternal grandparents in rural Mississippi in the late 1800s. So any brick wall experts out there, because the documentation is very scarce. Any suggestions on how he might find more information on his paternal grandparents from the 1800s Mississippi?
Does he know what part of Mississippi? Does he have a specific area of Mississippi? Does he know like what area of Mississippi they're from?
Let's see if he responds to that. While we wait perhaps for his response, Harold, I'm curious, how did you find your grandmother's resume? How did you come across that?
Oh, no, that resume was of my mother, who, you know, she was worked with the juvenile court system and was a probation officer and went to Fountain Inn up in our attic. And I have strict instructions as to how often I can go up to that attic, because I come back with dust and disease and everything. But she kept everything. She has my kindergarten report card where it said I needed improvement in working with others, which proved to be true. But she kept just about everything, and I was looking for something else, and just about a month ago found this resume she wrote. I don't know if it was preparing for a job she was looking for many years ago, but it listed the dates and places where she had worked, and you know, the Camp James Weldon Johnson we all heard about and all that. And it's just that she kept a lot of things, and I just found it. It was upstairs. So was that picture of my grandmother with the Bethel AME Church in 1927. And I saw the picture for a long time and never really knew who these people were or why. And then on the flip side, it said whatever the photography company was on in the Hill District in 1927. And then I looked closely at this lady with the glasses. I said, and her nickname to us was Petey. That's Petey, you know. And but it's amazing what we had and just had in our home.
Okay, wonderful. So we did hear from Mr. Udine. He says that his relatives are from a place called Enterprise, which is north of Hattiesburg, Mississippi. How does that help us, Monica or Lucretia?
Because what you can, you can try to find out what county that's in. Usually places, they have these little towns, but then they're also a county, because I know on my dad's side, they're from Whitman, which as you saw is very, very small, but it's Brooks County. And so you might be able to find some county records, maybe property records, if they owned any property. You might be able to find some information, at least like that they owned land and how many acres and where it was located, things like that. Maybe you can go into, I don't know if it's an incorporated town, they might have records as well in Enterprise. Because I'm assuming that he has does he have the names of those people?
Let's see if he responds to that. And being the 1800s, they could still have been listed as property, right? So he might.
Right, until after 1865.
Right, yeah.
1865 when the war ended. But before that, they could have been listed as property. There could have been, and there also were some free blacks. So you don't want to assume that every African American was a slave, because there were some people who were free.
Free people, right? Yes.
As well. But it could be, if it's after 1865, then they would be probably maybe in the 1870 census, 1880 census, just depending on when they were born in the 1800s.
Right. And if you're listening and you are local, there's a attendee who reminds us that there is an African American genealogy group that meets at their Homewood Library.
Okay.
So you should call the library and see how you might connect with that group, and they can probably be of assistance with helping people get started.
Right. There's everywhere, there's usually an African American Genealogy Society. I sometimes go to the meetings here in Richmond, and going to one of their meetings is what prompted me to look at my DNA results more closely. And that's how I was able to determine that my father wasn't my father, was after I went to one of their meetings and saw one of the speakers there.
Absolutely.
And they do have, they bring in speakers and experts, and they can really be helpful.
That's right. And if you are with us and you're not from Pittsburgh, as Monica suggests, I think that historical societies, local libraries are excellent places to get started. They can lead you to more resources. Oftentimes they have county courthouses they can ask you to go to that have records. But sometimes the libraries are the depository for those records. And so local libraries, local historical societies, whether you're in Pittsburgh or wherever you are, can be wonderful places to start. So Salah Uddin tells us that one of the things he discovered was that the rural records are not digitized. So you actually have to go to the county courthouse, and he's not certain of the surnames that his ancestors would have gone by. So when you talk about going to the county courthouse, that's an investment, right? Because you actually have to leave.
Right, because you have to travel.
You have to travel, right? Unless you form a relationship with a local historian and have someone engaged to research for you, it is an investment you have to be willing to make, because you have to travel or engage someone to do the services for you.
Right.
Okay. So here's a question. It comes from a friend of mine in Washington, D.C. And she asks, how have you dealt with unearthing some of the less flattering or surprising news about your family members? So Allegra, Lucretia, Monica O'Hara, we'll actually see if any of you can weigh in on this.
Let me, this will be quick. So it was my Aunt Hilda's account that her mother was fathered by the wealthy landowner where they all lived.
Right.
And this is from Aunt Hilda's account. She had a master's degree from Hampton University. She was a teacher for several years in North Carolina. So I would trust Aunt Hilda writing that. I don't think it didn't just come to her in a dream. So when we get this information, and some people in my family had this all along, and I didn't know that. So I went to a family reunion and wrote down a narrative of what Aunt Hilda said and what everybody else had, what other things we had found. And I remember gleefully running into the family reunion, handing out all this paper, and people are reading it. But some of my older cousins, I remember, came over to me and took me aside over by the shelter we have at the reunion, and said, some things are better left unsaid, and there was a group there that was not as enthusiastic about finding this information, because they had heard it before, they knew it, but they had no real interest in making it public. Being a reporter, of course, I find information, I'm going to run out in my old profession, put my earpiece in and go live. I've just learned, but they are like, hey, some things are buried for a reason. But then there are others who were interested in that. So as Monica said, when you start shaking the tree, be prepared for what's going to come out when you shake it, because not everybody receives it in the same way.
Lucretia or Allegra, any secrets on the 5%ers that have come out since you learned something about your mother?
Of course, but nothing I didn't already know. But I'm like Harold. I think that, the spicier the history, the more interesting of a people you are. But it just depends what that history is, of course, and what you want to keep it. But I will say, as the mother of a 13-year-old, that her father, my ex-husband, and I, are really keeping her abreast in knowledge of knowing everything about both sides of the family, meaning we talk about everything just so she can know, so she won't have any of those surprises about anything when she has children of her own. I think that's very important. And my parents have been so open to me about them and their past and their history. Like, I could write a book on it right now, very Dr. Dyer knows some of the colorful stories, but I just think that's important, especially for people who have children, to keep some of those colorful or maybe unflattering stories alive, because it's better to know your history and not to know, I think.
Yeah, and I just want to say that because I'm, like I said, I'm still in the very beginning stages of finding out where I come from. And I'm starting at the Tennessee Department of Children's Services. Getting my records unsealed, that uncovered some hard to digest information for myself personally. And I just want everyone to know that, to make sure that you are, emotionally prepared when you are digging up, historical records, or like in my case, adoption records, or when you're digging into your family history and learning about things that happened and who these people were, because it can be heavy, and that's exactly where I am, just to be, transparent with you guys right now, is working through that. And so, yeah, I just wanted to say that. That's all I have to add, because like I said, I'm still in the very beginning stages.
Great point, Lucretia. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it's important to realize, for our panelists who are doing stories and for our attendees who are thinking of doing stories, that what we're telling are stories of humans, right? And humans are not perfect. And so we're going to find chinks and we're going to find bruises along the way. And so it's important to recognize that that is all a part of what makes us human. And so when I talk about giving people a fullness, I think, like Harold and Allegra, it's important to understand the fullness of who they are, where the chinks were, where the bruises were, how people overcame situations. All of it is out there, and it's part of what makes us who we are. And I think the more we understand, the better we are. So one of the things that I found when Monica was helping me with some family history is that we found a news article suggesting that my grandfather had been a victim of suicide. And because I never had the chance, he died before I was born, but and when my father was very young, but my father was very private. He never talked a lot about his father and how he left us. And so not knowing that information, not having that information, I never had a chance to share with my father or ask him about what he felt about any of that, or how any of that shaped who he was or his life. And I deeply regret that. So, and also the situation about him committing suicide, to read that news article, that was suspect about how they said it happened. And so for someone to not to be able to elaborate on what it might have been, or if it could have been something else, is also a mystery. And so, yeah, talk to your family while they're here. Recognize that people are human, your family members are human. You will find traits and characteristics that you like, but you may find traits and characteristics that cause you to say, but they're all human.
I was just going to add to that, Dr. Dyer, because like with Lucretia, we share that kind of background of not being raised by our biological parents. And it was very emotional journey for me. That's why it took me so long to get started, especially on my mother's side. I would start to research all kinds of like distant cousins and find all these people, instead of going like directly to my mother, who was alive at the time. I kind of put it off and avoided until I finally did go and sit down and talk with her. And it was because of, how I knew that her life was at that time when she was having children, that it wasn't hard for me to believe that the person that she put on my birth certificate wasn't my biological father. I'm sure she thought that at the time, certainly. And I do believe that since finding out about my biological father, that he did not know about me. Because he did have another daughter that he was, you know, involved with and part of her life. And I'm sure it would have been the same had he known about me, especially since I was growing up in Chester and he was living in Chester, Pennsylvania at the time. But, you know, that just wasn't the case. I don't think that he knew. She thought it was someone else. And, you know, those are the emotional things that you have to deal with. And like Dr. Dyer said, realize that people are human. You know, where people start is not where they usually finish in those terms. So when I did meet my mother, she was a totally different person than when, you know, I had actually met her when I was young, like a teenager. And that wasn't a good meeting at all. And that kind of kept me from going, you know, to want to talk to her again. And so by the time I talked to her, I was in my 40s. And she was a totally different person at that time. So just learn to, you know, forgive people, you know, if that's your situation and you know, you work with your biological parents for whatever reason, you know, try to get past that hurdle so that you can, you know, if that's an area you want to pursue in terms of finding family and writing these family stories, you know, that'll help you get past that hurdle.
Very good. And with that is 1 o'clock, so I don't see any more questions from the group. So I want to thank Brother Harold Hayes. I want to thank Monica Haynes. Thank you, Lucretia Wembley and Allegra Battle. I really, really appreciate you guys participating. I want to thank Andy. I know I've called him up a lot this week on some of his off hours, but we really appreciate you. And thank you to Nan in Texas for helping us work all this out. You can reach us. You can reach me at edyer@pitt.edu if you have more information or if you want to travel with us and explore Africana history and people outside of Pittsburgh. We'd be happy to take you. And with that, we're going to close it out. Thanks, everybody. Oh, we want to thank our sponsors too, University of Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh Black Media Federation, and the August Wilson House, right, for always encouraging us to tell our stories. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.